imagination. And last time we talked about, I'll just review this real quickly, the idea of the Christian worldview. It looks something like this, this ugly picture, where truth, with a capital T, comes from God. So that's why it's a big bubble up in the sky, is from God. There's little t truth out in front of us, the world we live in, that we have our five senses involved in. And that truth, that world is ordered by God in the way in which He created it. And we are born with some knowledge already inside of our heads, but to understand the unseen truth or the transcendent reality, we need our imagination. And so that's why we're talking about the Christian imagination, because we don't have direct access to it. So how do we understand it if we don't have direct knowledge of it? So, just by way of review, we talked about pre-modernity and imagination. And pre-modernity was ordered by the church. I mean, the church really had emphasized this teaching. The church, very broadly speaking, had done this, and it's taught that the world was ordered, that was transcendent, and transcendent referred to three main categories: truth, goodness, and beauty. And the world that we live in is moral. And we believe, this was the kind of the catchphrase, we believe in order to understand. So in order to understand the world around us, we first have faith and in God and what God says. And then we seek to understand the world around us by means of our faith. We don't try to understand the world around us and try to increase our faith or to come to belief through that means. So in other words, it won't make sense to us unless we first have a knowledge of God. And we talked a little bit about the moral imagination that helps us to understand these things. Modernity said the world is ordered, but we don't know how. So this is, like I mentioned before, medicine, our health care system, your doctor, assumes that the world is ordered. And if something is wrong with you, it means that something is not working according to the order established. Now, you might say established by nature, established by evolution, established by something else, or you might say established by God. But the point is, the world is still ordered, or we can't live in it. If physics doesn't work, Elon Musk can't fly to Mars. Okay, the world has to be ordered and he has to assume that order in order for that to happen. The question of morality, of course, well, the world should be moral, but we don't know why. There should be right and wrong, but we don't know what it should be or who decides it. So this is where our world is, you see this craziness going on a lot right now, is the debate over what should be right and what should be wrong. What does free speech mean and what does it not mean? All of those things. And there is no transcendent. Okay, we don't have access to the transcendent. And so the goal is to understand the world around us, and if we understand it correctly, then we'll come to faith. And how do you know you understand it correctly? Well, in the scientific days, it was, you had to have the right method. If you have the right method, then you will understand it correctly. So the scientific method arises out of this. Actually, modern hermeneutics arises out of this as well, that we come to the Bible. You can only understand it if you have the right method, and which is not quite accurate. And we talked about the idyllic imagination, where we put pieces of things together based on other things that we already know, like a dragon. We'll talk about dragons a little bit later. And then post-modernity, there's no order at all. There is no transcendent of any kind, and morality is merely power. So who decides what's right or wrong? Whoever has the power. They decide what's right or wrong. And there's really nothing but despair. So people who have fallen into the trap of, and truly, who are true followers of postmodernity, they have nothing but despair. They are people who are very mentally and emotionally unstable. They don't see that life is worth living for anybody, let alone themselves. And you don't meet these people a lot, but you can meet them on occasion. I work with one. So imagining the transcendent, we talked about this, I think, before. Yeah, I think we looked at this last time. So in order to imagine the transcendent, we have to use metaphor. There has to be something that we see here in this world that helps us to understand the transcendent. And in the scriptures, God has given to us divine metaphors. So one very clearly is the idea of a shepherd, and the fact that God is called the shepherd of Israel, Jesus is called the great shepherd of the sheep. It's not that we looked at a shepherd and then assumed certain qualities about God. God has told us that he has put shepherds into the world so that we can understand him. And so that's a divine metaphor that's given to us in Scripture. And we don't have the right to go make up our own metaphors. I was thinking a little bit about this on the drive down this morning. There was, somebody did this. Who is the person who wrote the book of, like, Virtuous Birds or something like that?
Pastor used the ant.
Yeah, Proverbs uses the ant.
Maybe
That's
not the
it.
same.
Bill Gothard. So Bill Gothard, which I don't know a lot about Bill Gothard, but what he did is it seems to me, that he tried to come up with, find divine metaphors in nature, which might be good object lessons, but there's a difference between the object lesson and the divine metaphor. Yes, the ant is used in Proverbs as a metaphor, but we can go too far with our ant analogies. Not our aunt analogies, but ant analogies. And we talked about the transcendent is the capital T truth, and immanent, which we drew this new picture and used those words. Oops, okay. Transcendent is what we talk about being eternal, rooted in God himself, and the immanent is the world around us. Okay, so memory and simple fantasy, I think we talked about this one too. So we had the imagination and our memory, and how we remember things. I use the illustration of the snake. How we remember things is often determined by how it affected us at the moment. So we use the illustration of 3 different people seeing a snake and then talking about it later, how they remembered it, how are they imagining it, and they were remembering it differently depending on the effect the snake had on them at the moment. Factually, their memories were all correct. They all remembered the same thing. There wasn't one person remembered it correctly and another person remembered it incorrectly, but there was a bit of filtering that went on, a bit of interpretation that went on, which gets us close to what art is, which I think this might have been where we left off, is on the issue of art. So I have an illustration. Oh, yeah, Sophia's thing. I guess I don't. Thought I had something. So this gets us close to art, but not quite art. In that, if you're trying to describe for someone the emotions you felt at that moment when that event occurred, and you're trying to help them see or feel what you felt at that time. And when you do that, it becomes art. Now, it almost becomes art. We'll get to that, because I think I have a slide coming up for that. Okay, so I think this is where we left off. Speculative yeah, we didn't talk. Oh, that's why I've got my note. My notes are sitting in front of me, but they're in the wrong order. Okay, we're good now. I'm on the same page as myself. Okay, speculative fantasy. So, when we talk about imagining things, we talked a little bit about dragons, right? Imagining something that doesn't exist, supposedly, by putting together things that we know that do exist. And so I had used that picture of a dragon before. You know, it has the wings like a bat. It has a body kind of like a dinosaur. It might have a head like a horse or a mule. It breathes fire, right? There's certain things about that. Some dragons in history have 2 legs, just hind legs. Some have 4 legs. Some have no legs. Like, you have the Chinese dragon, which is much different, but it's still a dragon nonetheless. This is why I tend to think that dragons really did exist at one point in time. But anyway, we'll say it's speculative. Fantasy. So when we do that, when we think through and create something new in our minds, we're doing a creative act. So we are creating something in our mind that doesn't exist. Now the Bible actually does this. There are several people. Now when I grew up, the word fantasy, especially referring to literature, was always kind of a bad thing. Don't read fantasy literature. And it wasn't, I was always warned against it, not because it was fantasy literature, but because the content of the fantasy literature was usually pretty rotten. But it got stuck in my head to the point that when I had never read Chronicles of Narnia, because Chronicles of Narnia was considered fantasy literature. And then I was like, oh, I don't want to read that. And it took me quite some time to come to the realization that it was okay to read, because the content wasn't trash. It was the books my wife gave me, in case you're interested. Which is true, but it has a negative connotation. Yeah, it was like an apple or a pomegranate. But, in Judges chapter 9, we actually have an illustration, a divine, again, inspired illustration, where the scriptures use this illustration, this metaphor, that we would call fantasy, in Judges 9, in verse 7. Well, actually, I guess in verse 3 a little bit. But just to get the context, Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, went to Shechem to his mother's relatives and said to them, and to the whole clan of his mother's family, say in the ears of the leaders of Shechem, which is better for you, that all 70 of the sons of Jerubbaal rule over you, or that one rule over you, being Abimelech. Abimelech wanted to be king. And remember also that I am your bone and your flesh. And his mother's relatives spoke all these words on his behalf in the ears of the leaders of Shechem, and their hearts inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, well, he is our brother. And they gave him 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Baal-Berith, with which Abimelech hired worthless and reckless fellows who followed him. So Abimelech is not a good king. He wants power for himself. He's being greedy for it, and he's being political about it in order to get the power. So verse 5, he went to his father's house at Ophrah and killed his brothers, the son of Jerubbaal, 70 men on the stone. So now he goes and commits murder to make sure that not any one of the 70 could become the king or the judge, the ruler. And all the leaders of Shechem came together and all Beth Millo, and they went and made Abimelech king by the oak of the pillar at Shechem. So there's a particular tree there that they would do this. Now, verse 7, when it was told to Jotham, who was the judge, he went and stood on top of Mount Gerizim and cried aloud and said to them, listen to me, you leaders of Shechem, that God may listen to you. The trees once went out to anoint a king over them, and they said to the olive tree. So he's beginning to tell them a story where the trees are looking to have a king, and they convene a council. And they're talking to the olive tree, reign over us. But the olive tree said to them, shall I leave my abundance, by which gods and men are honored, and go hold sway over the trees? And the trees said to the fig tree. So the olive tree turns them down, so they go to the fig tree. You come and reign over us. But the fig tree said to them, shall I leave my sweetness and my good fruit and go hold sway over the trees? So the trees said to the vine, you come and reign over us. But the vine said to them, shall I leave my wine that cheers God and men and go hold sway over the trees? And all the trees said to the bramble. Okay, so you'll notice that there's a little bit of a digression. They go to the olive trees, they go to the fig trees, they go down. Now they're talking to a vine, which isn't even a tree, and a grapevine. And then now they're talking to the bramble. Okay, they're talking to the buckthorn. So here's these mighty trees who are talking to the shrubs, the bracken. And they say, come and reign over us. And the bramble said to the trees, if in good faith you are anointing me king over you, then come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, let fire come out from the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon. Of course, cedars of Lebanon are the huge, strong, they're like the redwood trees of California. And here the bramble is going to rule over them. The weak, the annoying bracken that grows in the shade of the cedar trees. So this is an illustration, not to teach on Judges 9, but this is an illustration where the scriptures themselves, the judge used it to make a point to the people of Israel that Abimelech, in this case, is no better than the bramble in the story. Okay.
I always thought it was kind of related to our political system and people voting in people that are rebels.
Yes, well, yeah, and Proverbs does talk about that. Or, you know, what's the saying? If the penalty, it's an old Stoic saying. Basically, the penalty for not being involved in your local politics is that you get ruled over by someone you didn't vote for. So the worst get voted in other words, if you don't be part of the process. Okay, so the idea of this kind of fantasy then is it allows us to imagine a situation that has not yet occurred. It allows us to prepare for it. Now, as I've been studying for Proverbs has been coming into my mind, and one of the things that Proverbs does, and I did mention this last time, it's been a couple weeks, is Proverbs wants us to be wise so that when we are confronted by situations in life, we know how to handle them. We know how to discern them, and we know what the right path to take is, which is opposite of the kind of the modern philosophy of, well, live and learn. Go out and live your life, make lots of mistakes, but as long as you learn from your mistakes, it's okay. Well, the book of Proverbs is saying, no, you don't go out and live your life like a bull in a china shop. Don't go out and make a bunch of mistakes and learn from them. Learn from the scriptures first, become wise in them, and don't make mistakes. That's a better way to live. But Proverbs can't give you every scenario you're ever going to face in life. But that's why it gives us principles to use and discern when these various times come. But so we have to have our imagination has to allow us to do that. Otherwise, we would always be behind any situation in life. We would, it's kind of like crossing the street when you're a kid. Well, some of you probably never crossed, John never crossed the dirt road, but when you're a kid, I grew up in a small town, and the road in front of our house was busy. It had a lot of traffic on it. So what did my parents do when I was 4 and 5 years old? Don't go in the street. That's simple. But as I got older, what would they do? Well, we would go up to the curb, they would hold my hand, they would look both directions. Do you see any cars? No. Is it safe to cross? And then they would determine it was safe to cross, and they would drag me along. And by the time I was 8, 9 years old, well, I was crossing the street all the time without anybody holding my hand. But we never sat there with a calculator or a gun, not a gun, but a speed gun, thank you, to calculate how fast the traffic was really moving. We didn't write up every single principle. Now, if the car is traveling at 29 miles an hour and you see that they're at a distance of, 1,372 feet, that now it's okay for you to cross, assuming that there's no cars coming from there wasn't like a log book of all possible scenarios. What we were taught was discernment, to cross the road without being struck by a car, which I was successful. Just to let you know, I was never struck by a car that I know of. So anyway, so this idea of fantasy, this idea of imagining things that we have to have in order to live in the world, and there's more that we could say about that, but we'll move on. There's where is it? Here we go. Let me get to this slide. This is the slide I'm trying to get to. So we're almost back to the idea of art again. And I want to come back to this again. So we have truth. We have the truth that we share in common here. But you'll notice in this, I added another little piece to it, this other little image there in the middle. And this is where art, the idea of art comes in, is when I imagine something about the real world, the capital T truth, because of an experience I've had in this world, in lowercase t, and I want to share it with you. So how do I share it with you so that you understand it, feel it, see it from my perspective? And what I do is I present it somehow in such a way that you can share in it. So when you share into that image that I'm creating for you, whether it could be through poetry, it could be through music, it could be through painting, sculpture, architecture, as I'm presenting this thing that I've seen, this thing that I've felt, so that you can see it, this is where art comes in. And so when we tell each other our stories, storytelling, I guess in this case, could be an art, this is what we're trying to do. Let's get us here. Okay, so let me, back to where we were. So, perception and significance. The idea of perception and significance is that we look at the world around us, perception, and there's something that strikes us as significant. So sometimes you'll hear, like Corey will try to, no offense to Corey, he's not here, but I mean, when I say Corey tries to do this, Corey tries to do this on Sundays once in a while when he gets up to give announcements, because he finds just giving the announcements, rather tedious, right? Do any of us enjoy sitting there listening to the announcements? Okay. So he tries to add a little something to it, and sometimes he'll say something. He'll talk about the stars in the morning during his morning jog, or he'll talk about the fog, or he'll talk about the sunrise, or we're in the middle of a drought and we get an inch of rain. Those kinds of things, that perception. And he'll try to share with us the significance of that perception. We all saw the stars. We all saw the fog. We all saw the sunrise. We all saw. But what Corey tries to do in those cases is he tries to share with us what the significance was to him so that we can share in that same emotion that he had at that moment in time. And often, again, metaphor is how we do that. We have to share in a roundabout way to help us understand. All right. Now, the next imagination, secondary imagination, this runs together, did I die?
Yeah, it's still on.
Oh, yeah, the battery. These are that. There we go. Can you hear me now, John? No. All right. So last time we talked, so this runs right into this next set, because I kind of jumped ahead a little bit, but when we're trying to reproduce the imagination, there's a technical term called evocation. So evocation means to call out or draw out from someone something. So the idea of the artist then is to produce a work of art that shares with us what their sentiment was and draw out of us the same sentiment. So this gets us back here. So the artist puts out an image, and in order to say, this is what I felt at that moment, I want you to feel it also. And what they try to do then is they try to call that emotion out of us, draw it up out of our heart, not force it on us from outside, but to actually call it out of us. So here's an example. We're going to do a little poetic example. Are you ready for this, Joanne?
Yes.
All right. This is a poem composed upon Westminster Bridge, and it was written by William Wordsworth, who is a British poet, romantic. C.S. Lewis pokes fun at him from time to time. But he wrote this poem, and I thought we'll look at it briefly here. We'll just look at this briefly, and then probably next week we'll look at, there's a biblical poem we'll look at as well. But composed upon Westminster Bridge. So Wordsworth is walking across London in the morning. He is walking across Westminster Bridge, and the sun rises, morning breaks, at the very moment he's crossing the bridge, and he's looking out. It illumines the city of London. Okay, so this is where he's at. And this is what he says. Earth has not anything to show more fair. Dull would he be of soul who could pass by a sight so touching in its majesty. This city now doth like a garment wear the beauty of the morning. Silent, bare, ships, towers, domes, theaters, and temples lie open unto the fields and to the sky, all bright and glittering in the smokeless air. Never did sun more beautifully steep in his first splendor, valley, rock, or hill. Never ne'er saw I, never felt a calm so deep. The river glideth at his own sweet will. Dear God, the very houses seem asleep, and all that mighty heart is lying still. So this, seeing the London at this moment of time catches his attention. And he starts, in catching this wonder, he talks about London, as he mentioned, he calls it the city. He needed 3 syllables instead of 2. London's only 2 syllables. He compares it to a sleeping giant. And he says, now, the first line, earth has not anything to show more fair. There's nothing more beautiful than what I'm looking at right now. Nothing as beautiful in the whole world as what I'm looking at right now. And dull would he be of soul who could pass by a sight so touching in its majesty. In other words, everyone else who's rushing off to work alongside Wordsworth and didn't see this, they are dull. Okay? They didn't catch it, and they should have. So, he says the city is like a garment wearing the beauty of the morning. So this giant, who's actually asleep, I think, it's here. So yeah, in the first to last line, the very houses seem asleep, the heart is lying still. So this giant is sleeping here, and it's wearing the beauty of the morning. So it's bedclothes, I guess you would say, in the Old English. Silent, bare, it's quiet. Okay, the ships, the towers, the domes, the theaters, the temples lie open to the fields and to the sky, all bright and glittering in the smokeless air. So what do you know about London during the Industrial Revolution? The air was never smokeless. Okay. But Wordsworth here begins to see something that's not, in a way, really there. Notice that he says, all bright and glittering. Okay, everything's open to the sky, it's all bright and glittering. So if you were to imagine seeing a city and describing it as bright, as glittering, as the air being perfectly clear, what might you be describing?
Green light heaven.
Yeah.
Now, I disagree because at dawn, the light could be glistening off of the dew that's on the buildings and stuff, and it could be glittering, and the air would not be nearly as smoky in the early morning because none of the factories would have been pumping out pollution at that time.
Okay.